Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Chariwag, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology at Savitribai Phule, Pune University. Today we are going to discuss the module on Marxist approach to the study of Indian society. This approach is developed by A.R. Desai. This module has been written by Poulomi Ghosh, who is a research scholar at Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. In trying to understand Marxist approach to the study of Indian society, it is very important to know that unlike Ghurye and unlike Srinivas, Desai really charted out a very different trend of understanding Indian society. As compared to Ghurye and Srinivas, the legitimacy or the influence of Desai was not very much to be seen. It was only reflected in the works of few scholars. Despite the fact that his works were considered to be very important and seminal, the influence of Desai was not so much as one would have expected. The other very important aspect of Desai was that he did not only consider his classroom as an important aspect. For him, it was very important that his ideas and his teachings read and reach the larger world. The objectives: 1. To understand the Marxist approach in studying Indian society. 2. In understanding Indian society through conflict and struggles. 3. Desai's conceptualization of a Marxist approach influence in shaping the discipline of sociology of India. Introduction. The words Akshay Ramlal Desai and was the first and foremost a Marxist and then a sociologist and teacher. Patel reflects this clearly, the manner in which Desai wanted to be defined. For Desai, it was his Marxism that structured not only his sociological practices but also his pedagogy and politics. Desai is considered as one of the pioneers in introducing the modern Marxist approach to empirical investigations in social systems. An examination of his life reveals that in his early years, Desai was influenced by his father, Ramanlal Vasantlal Desai, a well-known literature. His father, argues Patel, inspired the youth in Gujarat in the 30s to undertake developmental work for social transformation. Inspired by his father, Desai took part in student movements in Baroda, Surat and Bombay. Desai's studies did not deter him from taking part in political activity. He graduated from the University of Bombay and also obtained a law degree and PhD in sociology under G.S. Ghurye from the same university in 1946. Even in Bombay, he got involved in the labor front and organized a trade union of Bombay electricity supply and transport workers, dock workers and glass workers. Scholars in India who have extensively engaged with Desai's sociological perspective include Balagopal, Shah, Sujata Patel, and Savoor. The sociological vision of Desai was Marxist, argues Patel, that questioned the mainstream sociology's conservative positions and presented a rather interdisciplinary social science view. It was the time period of the 1940s and the 1950s that framed the sociological imagination of Desai. Thus, the transition period from colonial to independent India and the nationalist discourse shaped to a large extent the perspective adhered to by Desai. Though Desai was a student of Ghurye, he had very little engagement with Ghuryan perspective, rather made critical departures. Patel argues that Desai made use of Marxist perspective to a critical assessment of Indian society and in the process attempted to wean away sociology from the structured mainstream anthropology institutionalized by the Ghuryan perspective. It is important to recognize that Desai's work has to be analyzed within the process of institutionalization of social anthropological perspective of sociology. In such a historical movement, the scholarship of Desai presented an alternative to the institutionalized conservative sociology. How did he do it? Nagla states that Desai had advocated the use of dialectical historical model in his sociological studies, as he was influenced by the works of Marx, Engels and Trotsky. Thus, Patel argues that Desai has been one of the only sociologists who have consistently applied Marxist methods in his treatment of Indian social structure and its processes. He rejected any interpretations of traditions with reference to religion, rituals and festivities. His sociology is essentially a secular phenomenon where he relies on economics to understand and analyze social structures. He has studied topics like nationalism and its social configuration and examined community development programs for economic development in villages, treatment of urban slums and their demographic problems, and finally peasant movements. All of these studies are based on a Marxist method of historical dialectical materialism, argues Shah. For A.R. Desai, contradictions emerging in the Indian process of social transformations arise mainly from the growing nexus among the capitalist bourgeois, rural petty bourgeois, and the state apparatus. This nexus thwarts the ambition and aspirations of the rural and industrial working class population. For Desai, this contradiction is not resolved but rather takes on a cumulative form and methods and re-emerges as social movements and protests. Social unrest for him is thus rooted in the capitalist path of development followed by India, following the legacy of national movement, argues Balagopal. Patel argues that Desai's sociological practices, vision and perspective stands out, offering a largely alternative framework to theorize Indian society. As students of sociology, it would be important to understand how the perception of Desai was different and the frameworks he used to develop an alternative sociology in India. According to Patel, the alternative vision includes 1. Desai focusing on analyzing the relations between the macro and the meso, capitalism, nationalism, classes, among the other things. Sociological practices in India were bound by an analysis of micro, for example, the village. 2. The dominant perspective was that of analyzing the social from an ahistorical perspective, and Desai argued for a sociology that was interdisciplinary and framed by historical perspective. 3. Field work and participant observation was the dominant methods of mainstream sociology in India. Desai's Marxist sociology used the historical method to give specific meaning to the Marxist notion of structure and various elements in its constitution in India, such as feudalism, capitalism, relationship between class and nation, peasant and working class, the post-colonial state, and the rights of the deprived, argues Patel. 4. The audience for Desai included not only the students and the researchers in the university departments, but also the literate population of the country. So, Desai was a public intellectual, different from mainstream sociologists who engaged with students and peers at research universities and institutes. Savour argues that Desai encouraged and trained his students to integrate theory and practices and demanded that they go beyond the classroom and involve and be part of the social movements that have emerged in the then society. An important strategy nurtured by Desai was to have late evening meetings where they discussed on original pieces by Marx and other new books, and have Marx study circle during Sunday mornings. The discussions, mostly interdisciplinary by nature, furthered a tradition within students to analyze India's problem at the macro level and then look at them historically. Desai's major writings can be clubbed into 4 broad categories: Indian nationalism, path of development, peasant movements, and state and society, democratic right. In the following sections, we will discuss each of its ideas and later conclude the section with a critical analysis of the sociological practices of Desai. Section 1. Indian nationalism. Desai was inspired by the question of how and why nationalism developed in India. This quest led him towards his doctoral work completed in the early 40s. According to Desai's understanding, nationalism is a historical category. His analysis in the social background of Indian nationalism is historical and is based on interpretation of primary sources. Its development has to be understood in the context of social and cultural history of a country. Indian nationalism is an outcome of a number of objective and subjective forces which have evolved since the beginning of the 19th century and has emerged amongst the social and religious diversities of the country, territorial vastness, and powerful traditions and institutions. As compared to Ghure, who perceived nationalism within the larger structures of Hindu ideologies, Desai located it within the diversity that defined for him the society in India. In his seminal work, Social Background of Indian Nationalism, and its companion volume, Recent Trends in Indian Nationalism, Desai realized the need for a comprehensive study of the structural transformation of Indian society during the British period. His concerns with understanding feudal production relations, their role and transformation, emergence of capitalist relationship, and nationalist forces are presented in these volumes, out of which the first has been translated into various languages and run into more than 10 editions, argues Shah. Central thesis of both the above mentioned volumes is that British rule destroyed the pre-capitalist forms of production relations and introduced modern capitalist property relations, which paved the way for Indian nationalism. For Desai, Indian nationalism emerged then under the conditions of political subjugation of the Indian people under the British rule. The British Empire introduced modern capitalism for their own economic advancement, radically changing the existing economic structures of the Indian society, introducing a centralized state, modern education, and modern means of communication and other institutions. This, in turn, led to the creation of a new social class who achieved for their own political and social power. These social forces, because of their very very own nature came into conflict with British imperialism and thus became the basis of and provided the motive for the rise and development of Indian nationalism. How did then nationalism grow in India? Desai argues that one could perceive the growth of national movement in 5 phases, each phase based on particular social classes which supported and maintained it. Thus, in the first phase, Indian nationalism had a very narrow social basis as it was pioneered by intelligentsia who were the product of modern system of education. Thus, for Desai, the social reform movement and social reformers were crucial to the development of nationalism in India. In his book on nationalism, Desai clearly states that Raja Ram Mohan Roy and his followers were pioneers of Indian nationalism. This phase continued till 1885 when the Indian National Congress was founded, who founded a new understanding of nationalism. It heralded a new phase which ended in 1905. The newness of nationalism was defined by the development that the nationalist movement now represented the interest of the new bourgeois society in India. According to Desai, the development in the modern education had created an educated middle class, the development of the Indian and international trade, and had given rise to a merchant class, and the growth of modern industries had created a class of industrialists. In the new phase, according to Desai, Indian national movement voiced the demands of educated classes and trading bourgeois such as Indianization of services, association of the Indians with the administrative machinery of the state, the stoppage of economic drain and others formulated in the resolutions of Indian National Congress. The third phase of the national movement, according to Desai, covered the period from 1905 to 1918. During this phase, the Indian national movement became militant and challenging and acquired a wider social basis by the inclusion of sections of the lower middle class. In the fourth phase, which began from 1918 and continued till the end of civil disobedience movement in 1934, the social base of the national movement was enormously enlarged. The movement, which was hitherto restricted mainly to upper and middle classes, further extended to the sections of the Indian masses. However, according to Desai, the leadership of the Congress still remains in the hands of those who were under the strong influence of the Indian capitalist class. It was from 1918 that the Indian industrial bourgeois began to exert a powerful influence in determining the program, policies, strategies, tactics and forms of struggle of the Indian national movement, led by the Congress, of which Gandhi was the leader. Two other significant developments during this period were the rise of the socialist and communist group since the late 1920s, which tried to introduce pro-people agenda in the national movement, and the consolidation of communalist forces which sought to divide the society. The fifth phase, 1934 to 1939, was characterized by growing disenchantment with the Gandhian ideology within the Congress and further the rise of socialists who represented the petty bourgeois element. Outside the Congress, various movements were taking place. The peasants, the workers, the depressed classes, various linguistic nationalities had started agitations for their demands. However, according to Desai, all these stirrings were not of much importance and consequences, and the mainstream was still widely and solidly occupied by the Gandhian Congress, which represented the interest of the dominant classes. Thus, as Patel argues, the nationalist movement in India was led and dominated by the capitalist class. It was able to do so by taking into control the Indian National Congress and through it defined the ideological and programmatic content to the nationalist movement. Section 2. Path of Development. Desai's State and Society in India, published in 1975, and India's Path of Development, a Marxist approach, published 1984, is conceptualization of India's capitalist development paradigm. He focuses his attention on the state and its role in social transformation of the society. His Marxist perspective leads him to observe that the state apparatus in the third world take various economic and social measures to protect the interests of its property classes. Thus, the legal and administrative frameworks are evolved to promote the path of capitalist development. He deems that the public sector, mixed economy and social welfare programs are nothing but the strategies adopted by the ruling class to cater to the interest of the capitalist classes and to prevent the rising struggles of the exploited classes in the state. His conclusion, based on his gathered data, is that the bourgeois class of the Indian state is incapacitated because it has not been able to foster enough of a capitalist growth rate to overcome the backwardness of the country. The central thrust of his volumes on rural sociology as well as agrarian struggles has been to show how the Indian state has planned and transformed the agrarian structure from pre-capitalist to capitalist relationship. Agrarian relations have been transformed substantially as a result of state intervention through various land legislations and development programs. Starting from the interventions of the British government, their introduction of the new economic reforms disrupted the old economic system by decaying the old land land relations and artisans with the emergence of new land relations and modern industry. The old village commune was eroded by the appearance of new peasant proprietors or zamindars as private owners of land. The class of artisans disappeared with the introduction of modern industry to be replaced by new classes like the capitalists, industrial workers, agricultural laborers, tenants, merchants, etc. Further, the land revenue system, commercialization of agriculture, fragmentation of land also led to the transformation of Indian village. Therefore, British reforms impacted not only the economic outlook of the country but also altered the social physiology of the society. It brought in new classes and therefore created new and different types of social relations. At a higher level, this structural change brought about by the polarization of classes in agrarian areas, poverty in rural areas, and exploitation by those who own land. It gave rise to a new class structure among agrarian society with categories like zamindars, absentee landlords who might own land somewhere but settled elsewhere like in cities, tenants, peasant proprietors, moneylenders. Similarly, in urban society, there were capitalist, industrial, working class, petty traders, and professional classes like doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers, etc. The introduction of railways, postal services, centralized uniform laws, English education, modern industry, and so on brought about qualitative changes and unintentionally led to the unification of Indian society in spite of being introduced as mechanisms of exploitation. For Desai, the role of railways and the press was especially significant in this direction. It brought together the scattered population into the mainstream, and the implication was social movements, collective representations, national sentiments, and consciousness at a wider level. This social infrastructural setup gave rise to the nationalist freedom movement and the awakening of Indian nationalism, argue Shah and Patel. Section 3. Peasant Movements. A.R. Desai's peasant struggles in India and agrarian struggles in India after independence immediately became and continued to be a major source of reference on agrarian social movements in India and sociology of agrarian society in India. In Desai's views, agrarian relationships have been altered substantially as a result of state intervention through various land legislations and development programs. According to him, the overall thrust of the agrarian policy of the ruler has been to eliminate parasitic absentee intermediaries in the form of various categories of zamindars and absentee landlords, and to create in their place classes of agricultural capitalists, rich farmers, and viable middle peasant proprietors directly linked to the state. As a result of this, there have been created sharp differentiations among the peasants, and the condition of small and marginal farmers and the agricultural laborers has deteriorated. Desai was extremely critical of the way land reforms that were being carried out, which created a class of private entrepreneurs in the form of agricultural capitalists who had surplus resources to invest in agricultural improvements for profiteering. Likewise, he also critically analyzed the policy and practice of promoting cooperatives and the Green Revolution, which created a further divide between the rich and the poor and led to the enhancement of economic and socio-political power of the rich. He strongly argued for the adoption of alternative development models that involved social transformation through basic structural changes in agrarian relations and institutions like the control of cooperative and industrial production. From the 70s onwards, Desai undertook projects to understand new movements and trends taking place across India, like the growth of contradiction in rural India, especially growth of Naxalite movement, and in urban areas as well, railway strikes, women's movement, and protest against slum demolition. For him, the working class, the traditional revolutionary force, was in the midst of changes both in the context of its structure and its changing political consciousness. His study of the working class movement was especially noteworthy because he did not restrict himself to the working class alone but encompassed the entire oppressed sections in the society who were selling the labor power in the market. He also made visible the definition of a worker and working class in his study and was first to notice the informal sector and the struggles of the unorganized sector workers, later to be theorized by economists and anthropologists, argues Patel. Desai puts forth that post-independence agrarian struggles are waged by the newly emerged propertied classes as well as the agrarian poor, especially the agrarian proletariat, where the former fight for greater share of the fruits of development while the latter struggle for survival or subsistence requirements for a better life. Desai maintained that progress could be achieved only by radically transforming the exploitative capitalist system in India. Section 4. State and Society Democratic Right. In State and Society in India, published in 1975, Desai puts forth a critique of the theories of modernization accepted by a large number of academicians. In all his work, he puts the state at the center and throws light on its role as a facilitator of social transformation and the role it could play in abridging the rights of the oppressed. He analyzed how the state, in its pursuit of modernization on a capitalist path, was playing a repressive role and growing resistance to the same. Desai classified democratic rights into three categories. Shah argues: 1. The rights of bourgeois property relations, which include the right to hold property, right to employ wage labor. Second, the rights which are also termed as civil liberties and which are the product of bourgeois revolution. They include freedom of speech, habeas corpus petition, freedom of press, public secular education. Desai maintains that though these rights are manipulated by the ruling class to serve their interests, the oppressed classes also use them to protect their class interest and accelerate their struggles. Third, like the bourgeois rights, there are rights of the proletariat which include right to picket, strike and organize. These are important for developing the struggle of the proletariat against the ruling classes. The second and third categories of rights are increasingly repudiated by the state to intensify the generation of surplus value and capital accumulation. Desai holds that the increased policing of the second and third rights are a result of the deteriorating socio-economic value of the capitalist framework, which makes it open to the criticism of substandard and exploited life and labor of people. Evaluation of A.R. Desai. For a large number of sociologists, including Marxists, Desai's project of sociology remained largely ideological and political and oriented to the debates within the mainstream communist movement, and particularly to the question of how to bring about a capitalist or socialist revolution. There are Marxist scholars who argue that Desai's analysis lacked depth and was too simplistic and thus wasn't able to understand the complexities that structure Indian experiences of capitalism and the nature of protest against it. Desai's work is also criticized for not having a theoretical perspective to assess and examine the intersection of class and caste, nor its interactions with gender, ethnicity or language. It also does not conceptualize any theoretical foundation for examining the complexities inherent in identity formation within the subcontinent. His theory of identity was based on simple proposition that exploitative experiences need to be made visible in order to understand the exploitative processes. Marxist scholar K. Balgopal questioned Desai's triangular classification of agrarian classes: rich peasants, middle farmers, landlords. He also questions the division of struggle into pro-green revolution and post-green revolution periods, considering that green revolution was not introduced in many parts of the country. These arguments put forth by Desai do not have enough corresponding empirical evidence to support them. Balagopal questions whether the need of Desai to be political and ideological has put sociology to the background, whether the need to change the world rather than interpreting it defines Desai's sociology. Patel argues that problems of empirical substantiation occur in Desai's work, Social Background of Indian Nationalism. Desai argued that the pre-colonial India did not have private property and that the village was self-sufficient, autocratic and unprogressive. This builds up a very static and stagnant view of society that existed in pre-colonial India. Though later there have been enough historical materials to relook at some of his ideas, Desai did not do so. According to eminent sociologist Sujata Patel, Desai's theories have not paved the way for a new theoretical articulations on themes that he explored, such as class, the laboring poor, nation, nationalism, development, state policy. His theories could not engage with the complexities that modernity brought up in the context of the Indian subcontinent. In conclusion, A.R. Desai was a Marxist and a sociologist who did not see the difference between the two. Desai analyzed contemporary social change in order to assess how it benefited the few, and thus his work was a critique of mainstream nationalism and its political project. Its focus was on the nature of the ruling class, the control of the state institutions, and their constant efforts to use development projects to aid their own reproduction. It is important to recognize that apart from being an academic scholar, Desai also wrote pamphlets and booklets in regional languages for those in the struggles and outside the purview of academia. Desai's area of sociological investigation was completely and extremely wide, which began with a discussion of nation and class in colonial period and moved on to assess the state in the post-independent area. This analysis led him to assess planning and development in India together with the rise of new classes in agriculture and within urban industrial structure, and consecutively the contradictions and struggles that occurred because of this. The growth of social movements and the increasing communalization of the state led him to analyze the nature of state-society crises in contemporary India, which in turn led him to discuss the contemporary rights movement by the new social actors. His perspective was a revolutionary departure from the earlier understanding of mainstream nationalism and earlier conceptualization of politics in India. Desai argued that colonial capitalism destroyed the institutions that could have generated capitalism in India indigenously, and at the same time also mentions that colonialism had the positive effect of making possible the growth of new social classes, which helped to create conditions for the emergence of nationalist movement. The fact that Desai continued to write on the Indian state and society from a drastically different Marxist perspective during a time when American structural functionalism and British functionalism dominated social sciences reflects a strong belief in Marxism as a critical perspective to develop a nuanced understanding of Indian society. Shah states that Desai in his presidential address to the All India Sociological Conference narrated that the dominant sociological approaches in India are basically non-Marxist and that Marxism is rejected on the pretext of being deterministic, value-loaded in nature. He stresses on the importance of using Marxist approach in the discipline because he believed that it can help study government policies and the classes entrenched into the state apparatus in India's political economy. Desai highlighted certain aspects of the Marxist approach to the study of Indian society. It helps to understand social reality through the means of production, division of labor involved, and the social relations of production that it brings about. This approach can help trace the social and class structure that was there before independence and how and what the development paradigm has been since then. For Desai, property relations are crucial because they shape the purpose, nature, control, direction, and objective studying the production. For Desai, property relations are crucial because they shape the purpose, nature, control, direction, and objectives underlying the production. It also shapes the hierarchy and division in the society since it decides who gets how much and on what grounds. It also helps in locating the dialectics that exist within society instead of just looking at continuities and stability. As Patel argues, Desai could be referred to as a scholar activist with a scholarship defined by a political perspective and commitment to assess facts in the context of nation state and macro structures. In summary, we could see that how Desai used his Marxist perspective to understand society in India. He focused on the economics, especially in terms of class contradictions, but unfortunately he has not focused so much on the caste-class interactions and the gender interactions. What is important for us as students of sociology is to take away from this module and from this analysis is the fact that we need to move away from a contradiction of understanding Indian society in terms of only in terms of its class, but also to understand it in terms of its relationship with state and also that of caste and gender.